My name is Rachel, and today's guest on Studio Mouth Podcast is Gregg Clunis, host of Tiny Leaps, Big Changes.
This is the Studio Mouth Podcast, episode 38. I'm Harold Ree. Wherever you are in life's journey, remember that one person can make all the difference in your life and in the lives of others. Today's guest is Gregg Clunis.
If I can help one person who is interested in personal development that can actually have a very noticeable effect over time, but feels that they can't just sort of jump in, that's what I want the show to do.
Gregg hosts an amazing podcast called Tiny Leaps, Big Changes. He recently just achieved a milestone with his 100th episode. His episodes tend to be efficient and impactful, sort of like a wonderful blog post, but explained to you by a really intelligent host. Now, many of us have left a company to move on to another opportunity. In Gregg's case, he left the same company twice to go on his own entrepreneurial path.
This past December, I left that position and have been focused primarily on being a full-time freelancer and podcaster. But the December of 2014, I actually left that position and tried to make the exact same leap and failed miserably. So thankfully, I had added enough value to the company that when I reached back out, they were happy to sort of bring me back on the team. And that gave me an additional year to sort of correct the mistakes I had made. Then when I left this time, they obviously made it very clear that I'm not coming back, but they were also very supportive.
So you quit the first time, you go off on your own, and then you come back. So talk about the going off on your own part.
December 2014, it was my last day there was the last day of the year. So I really started off on my own in January. And I made the decision to leave because it was something I'd always wanted to do. I knew that entrepreneurship was the direction I wanted to go in. I just didn't know how. And I was also just getting very frustrated with not necessarily the company, but that type of role. I think I had identified this at that point. There are very specific times of the day where I'm at my best, and the sort of 9 to 5 schedule doesn't capitalize on that. So I would be there, but I wouldn't actually be doing good work. And I'm the type of person that hates when I'm not doing good work, or when I'm not trying to do good work, at least. Early January, I had been freelancing for about 4 years, just sort of on the side, primarily web design, but very sort of multidisciplinary. Currently, I do podcast production, web design, graphic design, and content strategy. Back then, it was mostly web design and podcast production. I landed a large client that should have been a very consistent monthly income, which is what sort of sparked that decision to make the leap, because I didn't feel that I would have enough time to do that on the side. And essentially what happened after I left, that large client that I had landed fell through. So I had about 2 months of savings. So I decided, okay, well, I'm just going to basically hustle and try to keep adding on to this saving. I had an apartment at the time that I decided to give up. I moved back upstate. I'm originally from a small town called Highland. It's about 5 minutes away from a slightly larger town called Poughkeepsie that maybe some people will know.
Vassar College, among other
Vassar
things.
is very close. I gave up my apartment and moved back in with my parents upstate just to sort of extend that runway a bit. That was, I think, one of the better decisions I made. But at the same time, I think it put me in a state of there was no real necessity to work as hard as I should have been working. And that was really what the mistake was. That was the reason that I think I failed miserably, is I ended up burning through all of my runway because I couldn't focus on what I should be doing, what I should be trying to build, and how to start generating an income now that this client had fallen through.
Right.
So by end of February, I had maybe a few weeks worth of runway left. And so I noticed that the company that I had left hadn't filled the role. And I reached out to my former boss, asked if it's something they'd be interested in. And I went back in for a second interview and got the position again.
You stayed at the company, another 8 months?
It was actually, I think, another 10 months. So I went back, and in the first 5 months, taking that break almost like renewed my interest in being there. So I actually got a lot more accomplished in those first 5 months back than I think I would have if I had stayed. Part of that was realizing this failure, realizing what I'd done wrong. And to some extent, for the first 3 months back, I was starting to sort of doubt myself a bit. I started taking the approach of, okay, well, I better just settle in here and try to build a career in this space, even though it's not necessarily what I want, because I tried this other thing and it didn't work. So there was definitely a lot of self-doubt there as well. So I went back, helped rebuild their website, helped rebuild their marketing funnel, made a lot of progress, and helped grow. The marketing department there at the time was, when I say very small, I really mean just me. I helped to sort of get that on a track so that it could grow over time. I think the real push to consider leaving again came when we discussed a potential raise. But essentially what it sort of highlighted to me was that I knew I needed to make X amount with the student loans that I had, and the raise that I was being offered, or the number that I wanted to get to, was projected more for sort of a 5-year period. And I didn't think it was that big of a number. And that sort of highlighted to me how limited your income really can be when you are in a traditional role like that isn't highly valued. So for example, if I was a computer science major and I was sort of the driving force behind our software, which is our only product, then I think I, number one, would have had a higher starting salary to begin with. But number two, I would have a lot more leverage in terms of negotiation when it comes to raises and so on and so forth. But because the marketing program had just really started, it wasn't a core piece of their overall strategy to acquire customers. There wasn't as much value placed on it. And so there was really no leverage to try and push to sort of a higher pay grade. And it just showed me what the path would look like if I stayed there. I spent the next 5 months from that period working essentially 12 to 15-hour days between the 8.5-hour workday and then trying to land and fulfill web design clients. And that was my primary focus at the time.
Serious amount of hours you're putting in.
There were a lot of nights where I didn't really sleep. Not something I essentially recommend, but thankfully it did get me to the point that I started getting some momentum with web design. An additional thing that I'm grateful for was a year prior to that, I had first sort of gotten involved in the podcasting space, and I helped clients launch a few shows. So while I didn't actively have my own show, I was valuable enough to land some recurring production clients, which gave me sort of a stable monthly income. Around November of 2015, I realized that through all of those hours and since web design is such a high ticket service, I was able to build up a sizable sort of runway.
Right.
And then I had these recurring clients. So I felt a lot more confident in my ability to take that leap again. And I was also very sort of disillusioned from the job. I gave myself 2 months to really consider it and think about it this time. And just after Thanksgiving, I told my boss that I was going to walk away again. And there was a bit of shock, but I think ultimately from the beginning of the role, from my very, very first interview, I had made it pretty clear what my ultimate goal was.
Okay. So let's get back to the podcast.
So there are two parts. For the listener, the overall goal is if I can help one person who is interested in personal development, interested in self-help, interested in all of those things that can actually have a very noticeable effect over time, but feels that they can't just sort of jump in. That's what I want the show to do. The whole point of it being research backed is you don't have to listen to me. You don't have to listen to this 23-year-old kid who has no idea what your life is like, because what I'm telling you is that these Nobel Prize winning authors and psychologists and neuroscientists, they're the ones that have done these studies that show, for example, that when you, going back to episode 1 of the show, when you make lists, there's a shift in your neurochemistry, which affects your ability to feel calm and whether or not you shift into what's known as frenzy. And frenzy is an emotional state that's activated by the amygdala, which is a very small piece of your brain, but it controls all of your emotions. Frenzy is categorized by anger, anxiety, and fear, and a few other negative emotions. But when you're in that state of frenzy, it makes it nearly impossible to focus. It makes it nearly impossible to feel a sense of calm. And then that obviously has an effect on your actions, your productivity, and your ability to sort of move forward in your life. So making lists is a fantastic way to sort of decrease that frenzy and get you back to a place that you can focus and move forward. And you don't have to listen to me about that, because I then share the research that's been done, the brain imaging, the mapping, all of that stuff that's been done to prove that. So that's ultimately what I want to do with the show, is create this space where someone who's interested in this stuff, but has always thought of it as sort of like woo-woo statements that just sort of sound good to say, can come in and get the pieces that are going to actually help them.
What's the frequency of the podcast? What's the length of your average episode?
Average episode so far has been about 12 minutes. When I launched, I specifically chose not to pre-record anything. So I have no episode bank. And that came from experience with one of my last shows, where when you pre-record and sort of plan out a month ahead or 2 months ahead, if you want to make any changes, which I find happens very frequently in the first 8 weeks or so of your show, you have to wait 2 months to see how those changes helped. So I have no episodes pre-recorded. And as a result, it gives me a lot of freedom to play with the frequency. Originally, it was going to be once per week. My goal is to produce 7.
Daily?
I'm going daily, at least for the first 2 months. I want to see if there is a process that I can figure out that will allow me to do that without pulling too much away from my client work.
Right.
And a big reason for that is simply because while the show is very heavily produced, so there's a lot of time that goes into it, there's a much larger reach for a daily show. And there's a much larger reach for anytime you increase the frequency, it allows the show to get through to more people. And if I can get it through to more people, then it has, as Gary Vaynerchuk would say, it has more at-bats in order to really affect the type of change that I want it to affect. And by increasing the frequency, I can much more rapidly figure out all of the things that need to go into it in order to create the show that I want it to be, which is not where it is now.
Although I think it's a good start. I think it's a very good start. How much time do you think you commit as far as research and thought process to, let's say, a 10-minute episode?
So if we're throwing thought process into it, once I figure out what the topic is, I'm usually working out how it's going to be structured basically at every moment of the day. As far as the hard time, sort of sitting down in the chair and working time, it's about 2 hours of research. And usually, so far it's been 2 hours because I've been pulling on articles that I'm already familiar with and books that I'm already familiar with. I don't know how that's going to change once I've sort of exhausted that space. Average so far, 2 hours of research. It takes me about 30 minutes to record. And I sit down and just sort of let the tape run and re-record lines over and over again until I get the right delivery on it. And then just cut out all the not good stuff. Overall, it's, 5.5 hours per episode, which is not, number one, that trying to do a daily show with that isn't going to be easy. So ideally, and this is actually a very good transition into how I see this for my own career. the approach I want to take is more treating the podcast as a media brand and treating the podcast as a form of media. So rather than I'm building a business, I like to say that I'm a media producer. Monetary goal of the podcast is to be run primarily through sponsorships. Once I get to the point that I can do that and sort of stop taking on freelance clients, and make the podcast and that brand my full-time position. Overall, I find that I get very antsy when I'm not working on something or thinking about something. I've never been the type of person that enjoys like sitting and watching TV, or I go out with friends and I enjoy like being with people, but when I'm doing that, the people that I hang out with are usually people that are doing very similar things. So we're there and we're discussing business things and podcast things. And those are sort of my breaks, is these areas where I'm not sitting in a chair and producing, but I'm still thinking about what my next move is. And I'm still considering ideas. And then I also have built, thankfully, a daily habit of journaling as soon as I wake up. So I do still have that sort of 10 minutes of quiet time where I can just sort of reflect on what's been going on.
Why should someone listen to your podcast versus any other business/productivity/entrepreneurship podcast?
The main differentiator that's going to attract a very particular type of person is the fact that it's going to be a combination of the cognitive sciences like psychology, social philosophy, neuroscience, neurochemistry, essentially the sciences that control our brain and its various control centers, with the personal development industry. The movement in the personal development industry right now, to me, is very much focused on just sort of saying what sounds good. I want to be the place that people can go in order to get the actual practical side of that. That is going to attract the type of person that is honestly trying to change their life. And if someone isn't at that point and they're not interested in that show, that's okay. But if you're not ready to change where you are, and you're not ready to do the things required to change where you are and work for a year, 2 years, 3 years in order to get there, then this isn't the right show.
Okay. How do people find your show, whether it's online, social media?
There's two main ways. I assume you're listening to this on your favorite podcast app. So the show is available through iTunes primarily. If you are on your computer or you prefer going to a website, you can go to www.tinyleaps.co. And that's where sort of the backlog of episodes as well as additional resources are going to be available.
Nice. How about on social media?
So on social media, there is a primarily Instagram and Twitter. So on Twitter, you can reach me at Gregg Clunis. That's GreggClunis. Or you can reach out to the show at Tiny Leaps CO. On Instagram, it's the same handles. So you can reach me at Gregg Clunis or the show at Tiny Leaps CO.
What are the goals do you have for 2016?
Biggest one is that I want to make this a full year of being self-employed. As I mentioned, the last time I left was early December. So the biggest goal is, can I stay self-employed or unemployed, as some people would call it, and provide for myself and not I live with my girlfriend, and the biggest concern for me when I left was, can I do this in a way that doesn't ever put her in a situation that she needs to be worried about where rent or bills are going to come from, or at least my half of it. So that's my biggest goal. Outside of that, it's building the podcast to a point that I have a large enough audience to pivot into some other media efforts. Eventually, it's going to be turned into a book, and that will launch a speaking career.
Nice.
And then I also want to use that audience to kickstart a documentary that will likely be more in 2017 or 2018, but I'm starting to think about what the concept will be now so that I can be ready for it then.
Quadruple threat. You're going for podcast, book, public speaking, and film.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've finally found, by sort of embracing, and let me preface that a bit. So I recently finished reading So Good They Can't Ignore You by Cal Newport.
Okay.
I highly recommend that every single person listening to this show read that book. I'm actually going back to my alma mater and recommending to every professor that I have a good relationship with that they make this required reading, because this is the most phenomenal book on career advice that I've ever read. And I read a lot of those books. I think I read like 56 books last year, and this one is phenomenal. So since reading that and sort of embracing this idea of not necessarily trying to build a business, but focusing on building the best show in this very unique combination of spaces that I possibly can build, embracing the idea of being a media producer rather than an entrepreneur, or I'm an entrepreneur / media producer. I want to use this platform not to launch courses or do webinars or any of sort of the standard internet marketing things to build in this business, but I want to use it to spread the message even wider. And the best way to do that is to build the audience and then use that audience as leverage to get a book published traditionally, because I think there's still a lot of weight to that. Get a film kickstarted, because there's no way I can fund it otherwise. And get on stage to larger groups of people that can benefit from this type of content.
Big goals, big dreams. What have we not asked you that you'd like to share with the audience?
So there's a thing that I say at the end of every episode of my show, and I'm starting to think it's going to be a part of probably everything that I produce in this space. And I don't know where it came from. I don't know if it's something that I just sort of put together from things I'd read, or if it's something I've heard someone say. The quote is, "All good things come from the tiny leaps you take every day." And the idea behind that, and just in case it's not self-explanatory, is that you don't get somewhere that you want to be by just jumping into it. You can't take that big leap. You can't jump off of the cliff and build a parachute on the way down, as some famous person once said, and I can't even remember who that quote's from. What you can do, though, is very, very slowly and very strategically build the life that you want. That might take you years. It took me 6 years. This summer, it's 7 years since I've been learning digital marketing and media production and digital business. And it's just this year that I've been able to say, okay, I'm finally making a move towards where I want to be. I may have made a lot of sort of mistakes and derailed from the path multiple times, but I kept learning throughout that entire time. I kept trying things and I kept horribly failing at them. There are people that have even more extreme stories than that. So it's not a big leap that's going to get you there. You're not going to be happier by following your passion tomorrow. How you're going to do it is by doing the things that you can do every single day that eventually build up momentum and lead to the life that you actually want.
We want to say thank you to Gregg Clunis for sharing his story. Make sure to take a listen to Tiny Leaps, Big Changes. You can find our show notes at studiomouth.com/38. Now, in case you're wondering where I've been all these weeks, I've been working on a podcast with my wife, Nancy, all focused on animal rescue. We interview the heroes of animal rescue, the people who really make it happen. So if you have any interest in animal rescue, swing on over to the Paw Print Animal Rescue Podcast. On our next episode, we'll be featuring Alana Rantala, who just released her first album. Well, that's it from us, folks. Remember that you can always make a difference in someone's life. So start today. Have a great day, everyone, and see you next time.
The Studio Mouth podcast is a production of EVER Education.
You can't handle the truth.